Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. Today, I'm interviewing Professor Dale Rice. Rice is the Director of Journalism Studies at Texas A&M University in College Station, where he's been for 12 years. Prior to that, he had a 35-year-long career as a working journalist, covering many different beats for a variety of newspapers. His last assignment was as the restaurant critic for the Austin American-Statesman. And full disclosure, I was one of the first students that Professor Rice had in his classes when he came to Texas A&M back in 2008. So, please refrain from sending him emails about what a bad journalist I am. I know. But he's had many wonderful students and has had a great influence on a lot of students. In fact, one of the classmates of mine is a guy named Rick Rojas. Rojas, you may see as a featured writer in the New York Times, where he is on the national desk. So, Professor Rice has had a great influence. He had a lot to say about the media environment and a lot of different things going on in the coronavirus world that we live in. Of course, I also had to ask him about what he's eating right now because he does know a lot about food and which restaurants he looks forward to going to after all of this craziness is over. I think you'll enjoy this interview with an old professor of mine, Dale Rice. Joining me now is Professor Dale Rice. He is the director of the Journalism Studies program at Texas A&M University, widely acclaimed as the best university in the world. Professor Rice, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome, Jess. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I should say that I was one of your first students when you came to Texas A&M back in 2008, and also in my class was Rick Rojas, who is now at the national desk of the New York Times. So he did pretty well, and I know you've had other students that have done very well. But Professor Rice, you've taught a lot of great students over the years. So thank you for what you do.
Well, I've enjoyed it tremendously. For me, it's been an amazing opportunity to have a 35-year career as an active journalist and then be able to have a second career in which I'm helping educate the next generation of journalists. Because as you know from being in my class, I've said it many times. I think that uh, journalism is such an important part of a vibrant democracy. And I think that the flow of information and truth is paramount. And so I'm uh, really happy to be able to be a part of the education of journalists.
Well, you've been a great influence on many people, and I mentioned Rick, and there's many others. But anything I do right in these interviews is because of Dale Rice. Anything I do wrong, you probably can't blame Professor Rice for that. So um, let me start right at the top with what everybody is talking about. Obviously, we're going through a coronavirus pandemic. If somebody's watching this in the future, the world is seemingly shut down, and Texas A&M is not doing in-person classes right now. No university really is, and the news media is shifting dramatically. And it seems, Professor, that in recent years there have been changes in the news media, but this crisis has really accelerated those changes very rapidly. Could you describe a little bit of that situation and what you see going on right now in the media?
Yes, I think what you talk about is that acceleration. If you look at the last 2 decades of media operation in the United States, you can see a substantial decline on the print side and a much bigger move online, including the online operations of people who are still involved in print. And that was uh, a pretty tough thing because it was the motivation behind it was the drop in advertising. And so newspapers were searching for a different model for financing, struggling to find ways to handle that switch, trying to find the balance with online and print. And some of them were doing okay. And in fact, there were still a few that were thriving. And then wham, along comes the coronavirus, and it's had just a huge impact on the media business. You see um, newspapers across the United States laying off people, some of them laying off substantial numbers. You see big chains like Gannett that are furloughing people. They're telling them they have to take 5 days a month without pay in April, May, and June as they try and make adjustments. There have been a number of weekly newspapers that have had to either totally move online or cut back substantially. I think we have a good example of the not far from here in Austin, the alternative weekly, the Austin Chronicle, announced a couple of weeks ago that they were moving to bi-weekly. So here you have a weekly newspaper that will now be publishing twice a month, its print edition. Part of that is also because the direct results are not only businesses not advertising, but those businesses include a lot of things that uh, the industry covered regularly: arts, entertainment, restaurants, the kind of thing that we've just shut down. So none of those places are advertising. And what are you going to write about it? Because none of the events are taking place. So the real irony of all of this is we've never needed local newspapers more than we do in a time of crisis. We count on those local newspapers to tell us what's happening in the community. I look at my local Eagle every day for the news on the coronavirus in Brazos County. What's happening here? How many deaths? How many additional cases? Is local government making any kinds of recommendations that we should follow? And I think people across the country are doing that. So it's just so sad that right now, when it's so important for us to have uh, an abundance of accurate information, the number of people who are engaged in that activity is being cut back substantially across the nation.
Yeah, I mean, after I was a city councilman and moved to the Texas Public Policy Foundation working on local government, I traveled to a bunch of small towns and met with many local officials and was surprised to find out that actually in a lot of small towns, say in rural Texas or other parts of the nation, the paper really is the only reliable source of news. And I know that one of the trends in print journalism for a while was the atomization or moving towards smaller, more hyper local newspapers in certain urban areas. For example, here in Houston, right, we've got multiple community based newspapers that the Chronicle operates. So it seems like really the revenue source that drives most of these papers has just totally gone away, and they're having to make some dramatic shifts. I guess who will survive this? I mean, are any of these small papers really in a position to survive essentially a total stoppage of funds that come in and actually provide the impetus for their operations?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't think they can survive if the stoppage happens and never resumes. So What I think one has to hope here is that the newspapers that are going to manage to continue publication on a shoestring for the weeks and months ahead to continue being that vital surface that we depend on, that when times begin moving back toward normal, that people will realize, you know, this was an important source of information for me. I need to subscribe. I need to make my financial contribution. And I hope that advertisers will turn around and come back. The Poynter Institute had a good story this week about the 7,000 weeklies across the country and what a tough struggle they are having right now, but that all across the nation, and they had lots of concrete examples of this, these little weeklies are determined that they're going to stay in business and be that lifeline of information for their local communities. So I hope that people in the end will see that we have a debt of gratitude, particularly to these small town newspapers, because as you noted, in many cases, that is the only source of local news. And so they are important, and I hope people really see that and eventually come to support them in ways they might not have before the virus hit.
Now, I could see one problem maybe being the sort of technical issue with running a small town paper. One of the things I've noticed, spending a lot of time with small towns and meeting people that run the papers, is that it's often maybe one guy who does everything, or one lady, or whomever, one person that actually runs the whole thing and does the reporting, and maybe there's two people there total in the office. But if that person suddenly has to find another job and the paper can't be restarted, maybe no one has the technical knowledge or the know-how to actually do that. I mean, so I could see them maybe going out and not coming back. Do you think it's realistic that if some of these papers shut down, they would be restarted, or if these publications go out of business, then that's pretty much it?
I think that you'll see a mix. I think you will see some of them go out of business and never return. And I think we have seen a handful of Texas weeklies do that in recent years. But Texas has actually overall been an unusual place because we've had a lot of weeklies that, as they struggled mightily in other parts of the country, continued to do well here. Maybe they were not flush with resources, but they were doing okay. I know of a number of weeklies around the state that have more than one person handling the operation, so that they actually cover a wide variety of news. I'm hopeful that that many of those papers will hang on, because it's going to be important for our communities that they do.
It sounds like it's going to be at least a tough couple of months at minimum for a lot of these papers to hang on. So let's talk about the difference between, in terms of the newspaper industry, the kind of the bifurcation between physical print and online, because I think a lot of people who maybe will watch this will say, well, what's the big deal? Why do you need printed newspapers when everyone's moving online? Why do you even need to worry about printing newspapers? Why can't you just put it all on a website? What would you say about that?
Well, I would say that we are probably moving in a direction where we're going to get nearly all of our news online. And so um, the actual printed paper is probably going to become less and less important to us. But what happens at that newspaper? In other words, the fact that people go out, gather information, sift through that information, decide what's important, and then figure out a good way to communicate it to the public is something that we really need, whether it's happening online or in print. I think print is served as a very visible reminder that people are doing this work. Once everything is moved online, we're going to have to think really seriously about how do we finance those papers, and to what degree um, do you see the ads? And I think that's probably one of the values of why you continue to have print editions in so many of these small communities, because the local grocery store, the local auto dealer, these are people who put the ads in the paper that you will actually see and have a chance to read. And I think it's a much harder thing if your ad is on rotation on the front page of somebody's website to assume that it's going to be being seen. So I think there's been a certain uh, value to print that both the publishers and the advertisers have recognized, perhaps more than the reading public has with it.
So the challenge I see there, and I mean, of course, we've already seen this. I'm just making it plain, I guess, is that with a newspaper, if you're going to have a physical newspaper and it's 1980 and there's no internet, you have to go out and buy or contract with a bunch of presses and have people to physically deliver the papers, and there's a lot of logistics involved just in doing that. Now anybody for almost no money or no money can start a website and say, hey, I'm the whatever. To some extent, that's what I'm doing with this little interview program, right? But how do you, if you're going to say, hey, this is the local newspaper of record, how do you really maintain that in the era where there are no barriers to entry and anybody can start a website and claim to be the newspaper for a town?
I think that's the challenge that so many newspapers face right now. That you're right. Anybody can start what they call a publication. And I think that thousands and thousands of people have. Um, but in this, for me, is a really big but. Um, but we need to recognize, what are those individuals doing? What is the motivation? Is the motivation to um, get the facts that are out there about local government, about the schools, about the local courts, the police, and transmit that in an unbiased fashion to the public? Or are hundreds, perhaps thousands of these startups actually at work with an agenda? And I think I would contend that an awful lot of them, left and right, are at work with an agenda, not at work with providing that long tradition of being the information source for your community.
Well, now we're getting to a place where I really want to go, Professor, which is a passion of mine, and it's just the fact that it's so difficult to find straight news anywhere. I have uh, uh, the flash briefing set up on my Amazon device, right? Where I ask it and it gives me news headlines, and I have it set up to where I get it from like, BBC and CNN and Fox News and Reuters is the only one that seems to me to be pretty straight news. Um, but I talked with Rod Dreher the other day. Rod is a former New York Post journalist, although he certainly comes from a very conservative blogging perspective now. And he mentioned that, he reads these left and right papers from all over the place just to try and get kind of what the facts are. How can a person distinguish in this crowded environment between, what is fact and maybe what is opinion or what is perspective? Especially given that if you go on Google News or one of these sites that you would think, okay, this is going to help tell me. I mean, if you look on Google News, you get left and right publications that appear right alongside publications that are maybe aiming for straight facts. So how do you make that decision when you're looking for the facts?
Well, that is the tough situation that readers face right now. And I think that we have to talk about this in like two or three different ways. The first is that all of us who are reading media sources need to make a point of reading across the spectrum. If there is one thing that I can instill in my students who leave here and never become journalists, it's the journalistic idea that they really need to read across a wide spectrum of viewpoints so that they understand where other people are coming from. And I think that that is really on the opinion side of media. And I think we need to distinguish that as well, that I think most people don't really understand the difference between what is going on editorially with a newspaper and what is going on in their news columns. And I note, uh, you know, I know people working at the New York Times and the Washington Post. I also know people working at the Wall Street Journal. People are quick to say, well, those folks working at the Washington Post or the New York Times are liberal. Those people working at the Wall Street Journal are conservative. I know the reporters there, and they are pursuing truth. They're not part of the opinion side of the paper. And I think that it's sad that we want to so quickly label everything associated with a publication that it's either liberal or conservative without recognizing that, in fact, there are many people out there who are trying to, as fairly as they can, pursue the truth.
Of course, I think that recently, politicians from both sides of the aisle have, I mean, and it really is, seems like probably about the most bipartisan issue in America is attacking the media, because everyone loves to attack the media that they don't agree with, or the ones reporting the stories that they don't agree with. I remember that Hillary Clinton did this when she was running for president, and Donald Trump, and everyone does it. So, I mean, is it not true, though, that there are some stories that maybe take on an issue that maybe is an issue of less relevance, and then they try to thrust it into the spotlight to gain attention for a certain reporter or for a certain publication? I mean, there have been instances in the past couple of decades with major stories that have had inaccuracies. I'm thinking of a New York Times reporter, and I cannot recall his name, who made up some stories, 15, 20 years ago, and I think was kind of ousted for that by the Times. I mean, they take, that sort of thing seriously. But what isn't there some kernel of truth in that, though, that you do have some publications and reporters that, maybe they're representing straight news, but it's not really straight news?
Well, I think you have a lot of people who want you to believe that they're offering you straight news when they're not. And I think that understanding the lines between what is the effort to offer you straight news and the effort to offer you news with an agenda in the guise of being straight news. And I think that's sometimes a lot more difficult for people to see and to understand. But you pointed out something, and I think we should talk about it for a minute, which deals with the political polarization that has occurred. You know, I think from your days in my class, I spent time as the Capitol bureau chief of a major Texas newspaper, and um, I was covering the Texas legislature and the governor when people work together on major issues, when compromise wasn't a dirty word. It was, how can we find some kind of common ground? And and interestingly, those politicians virtually never attacked the media because I think they appreciated the way in which we both inform the public and in a way help set that public agenda by bringing issues to their attention. Um, and then, man, have we moved to an era of polarization where it just seems that people scream at each other and no one listens. No one stops to have reasonable discussions, reasoned debate on the issues. And
That
that is so unfortunate.
seems to be getting worse in this present crisis too, because everything is it's like a band-aid's been ripped off, and now people are really at a fever pitch. You would think that everybody be coming together like in post 9/11, but I mean, I've talked to numerous folks about this. It seems like everything is getting more and more and more polarized in the middle of this crisis.
I, you know, it disturbs me greatly when I go online and take a look at a story in which one side or the other says, I won't negotiate. It's like, come on, people. We have to quit uh, taking these hard positions and begin acknowledging that we have to work together. But I think you're right that we're in a time when it seems to be so much easier for people to yell and blame somebody else for a problem rather than taking collective responsibility and working together to try and solve it.
So why do you think that is? That I mean, I'm sure there are numerous reasons, but what do you think are the chief reasons behind that attempt to kind of broadly paint the media, again, from whichever perspective somebody's coming, as the bogeyman, and to blame, reporters, rightly or wrongly, but to blame them for a lot of things? I mean, where does that come from? What's the drive behind that?
Well, I think it's probably the fact that um, the media is such an easy target because there are um, high profile individuals who do exhibit a political bias one way or the other. And I think that we often have a lot of people probably won't like me using this term, but I will. We have a bunch of talking heads out there who are espousing one political agenda over the other. And you really have to ask yourself how many of those people are actually seriously researching the issue and inviting people of a different viewpoint to engage with them in conversation, or are they trying to just espouse one viewpoint and move forward with it? And I think that's one of the things that's happened. We have some high profile individuals, left and right, who are easy targets for politicians on the other end of the spectrum.
But isn't it true that certain media outlets have maybe invited some of that criticism? I mean, because you do have, it seems like some outlets that have shifted over time to try and take advantage of the current environment, which presumably, if you can get more viewers, you get more advertising dollars and so forth. So maybe there's an incentive there to see these media outlets take on more of an opinion-driven tone.
Well, I think that some of them have taken on an opinion driven tone because it worked for them as a business model. If it didn't work for them as a business model and they were losing money, they would have shifted. But it worked as a business model, and so you know, somebody who takes extreme positions and attracts hundreds of thousands of viewers every night. Well, uh, what incentive does the media outlet have for curtailing that? In my view, they don't. Perhaps that's my cynical view, but it's still the way that I think that things operate in real life.
So, what's the place of more independent investigative journalists? I think immediately people like Ronan Farrow and Glenn Greenwald, who both have been, I guess, very controversial in their own way, but they obviously are very strongly investigative journalists. Greenwald, I think, used to work for the Guardian and reported the Edward Snowden story, and then left and started his own online thing. And Ronan Farrow, I think, has mostly been pretty independent throughout what he's done. I mean, what's the place of them in this current environment? Are we going to see more people like that, or is that kind of a dying breed?
No, I think you're probably going to see more of that because I think right now so many newspapers had to cut back on the number of investigative reporters that they had, and I think that you will see two things happening. One, I think the nonprofit area, like ProPublica, uh, you will see uh, the nonprofits joining with perhaps some for-profit media outlets, so to team up and do the work that they can do together that one can't do. And I think that you will end up seeing, because Rona Farrell's a good example of someone who was doing, in essence, freelance work for a variety of publications, and, well, not just publications, media outlets, because he was also doing it for broadcast. And uh, you have to give him credit for the Harvey Weinstein stories and much of the aftermath of that. And those were really tough, touchy subjects that required somebody to just doggedly go after. But, you know, there are other good examples of it. The doctor who uh, was involved in the abuse of the young women in the gymnastics team and all. Um, that was There was a reporter who pursued that story for several years until she broke open some really important aspects of it. And um, I think that people will see the valuable work that has been done by some individuals like that and will work to do it. And those will be people for whom the financial rewards are not why they're doing it, but for trying to make the world a better place.
So I think it would be obviously impossible to ask for a newspaper or publication filled with people like you, Professor Rice, because I've known you for many years, and I still don't know where you stand politically. So I think that's a testament to you and as a true reporter. But how can you judge? I mean, if we were going to give people advice on where to find good, straight, fact-based news, I named one outlet that I think does it, which is Reuters. But I mean, how would you judge publications that are out there? Because there are so many. I mean, we literally have an entire world full of these publications that are supposedly providing the news, and maybe some are, and some aren't.
Well, my advice to people is to pick at least one or two publications that are what I would say, I guess I would term it covering the world. In other words, take a Guardian or a Reuters or an Associated Press or a New York Times that have reporters all over the world, and read one of those for a sense of what is actually happening elsewhere. And then I think it's also really important to identify a major newspaper in your state that you feel is working hard to try and bring you some factual coverage. And I think in Texas, we do have a number of newspapers that would fall into that category, in my view, that because again, I know people working there and I know where their hearts are, and their hearts are in informing the public in the best, fairest, least biased way that they possibly can. And then I also think that you should then recognize that there are publications with agendas, and read at least one of those on the left and at least one of those on the right, and understand where they're coming from. You know, it's uh, students when they talk about that. It's for me, it's so easy. Like in my when I teach political reporting, to take somebody like Frank Rooney on the left at the New York Times and Kathleen Parker on the right at the Washington Post, and have students read that and say, look at what these people do. They at least rely on facts. They may come to different conclusions, but at least they are fact-based when they're doing it. whether they're left or right. And to me, that would be the important thing. If you're reading material in which it is all opinion, and someone is telling you what they think and why you should think that way, then I would dismiss it. I would say that's not valuable opinion writing, left or right. Go look for the columnists who support their position with facts, and then I think we'd all be a lot better off.
So not to get too granular, but I don't want to take everybody through a semester of one of Dale Rice's excellent journalism classes, but to recall your class and then also my time in public policy research, what you're saying is, regardless of the opinion casing that may surround a story, you want to look for maybe those primary source facts that are buried in those paragraphs that support whatever is being said. Is that kind of where that
That,
goes, or?
that I would say that's it exactly. If there aren't any of those facts there, then you ought to really think twice about whether you're wasting your time reading that person.
Right. And there certainly is a difference between primary source information like so and so on the ground in this place says this, or here's an empirical study, versus here's what somebody else said, right? Because a lot of people are linking, if it's online news, they may be linking to other blogs or other commentaries, things like that. And there's definitely a difference there.
Yes, there is a difference there, but I think that you know, if I were a political columnist who never cited independent studies that showed things, if I never cited government reports and what they showed, I mean, we can all take a government report on employment, let's say, and have a different interpretation of what it means, but at least we were fact based with where we took the initial information. And so many people don't do that. They just say things like, oh, employment's great. Oh, employment's horrible, and with no fact-based information to back it up one way or the other. And to me, that's really so poor journalism that I don't think people should spend their time there.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to the discussion about polarization because, obviously I've worked, a lot of my career has been in public policy and public policy research, but I've always tried to focus on facts and have intelligent discussions with people. I mean, that's what this is about. I think it's possible to have this program. It's possible to have discussions with people you disagree with and even read sources that you maybe disagree with. But people say, no, you can't do that. You can't read something from this or that other perspective. And again, that's a bipartisan thing. People on the left, don't want to read anything from Fox News. People on the right don't want to read anything from CNN, just to take a basic example. In general, Professor, why do you think our country is in the place that it is now? I mean, obviously, it's not just like this just happened yesterday. It wasn't just Trump or Obama or any particular person or movement, but how did we get to a place where we just hate each other?
You know, boy, I wish I had a good answer for that, and I don't. And you're right. It's not. It didn't begin with Obama. It didn't begin with Trump. You know, I I went to a dinner party many many years ago when I was a working journalist, and I was there, and most of the people at the time who were at that dinner party, there were at least a dozen people. Most of them had PhDs, and I would have, under any other circumstance, have said these were really thoughtful people. And then over the course of conversation about what they read, they began admitting that they had given up reading across the spectrum in terms of the sources, and they were reading the sources that reinforced their own perspective. And I was so taken aback at that moment and thinking, my word, you people, you are supposed to be among our best thinkers. And here you're telling me that what you're all doing, whether it's left or right, you are just simply giving up reading the others and seeking out only that reinforces your own opinion. So, you know, why were they doing that? I don't have a good answer, but that'll take you back to a dinner party 25 years ago where I encountered that. So back in my days as a working journalist, and thinking, my word, we're headed in a really uh, tough way if we can't seek out different opinions, and think about those opinions. Why should anybody think I'm right all the time? I mean, I shouldn't think I'm right all the time. Surely I'm wrong on some things, and I need to have other viewpoints that help me make adjustments in what I'm thinking. You know, I'm not ashamed to say that I've changed my position on some things, that I think differently on some things than I might have 6 months or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. To me, that's what being an informed citizen is all about, the ability to take in that information, think about it, and process it, and maybe admit, hey, I guess I wasn't right. And why should we hate people who do that? And why do we just put on a pedestal everybody who says I'm right and everybody else is wrong, and just believe me?
Well, so at what point should services such as Google or Facebook or Twitter um, maybe censor certain sources of information? I mean, we had this over the last few years. You've seen some questions around certain more controversial news sources, alternative news sources, or opinion sources. Call it whatever, but these platforms are taking people off the platform. And I know that that's a concern to people on both the left and the right, because it's happened to folks on both the left and the right. It's gotten a lot more coverage when it's happened to conservative media, but it has happened to some on the left as well. And of course, these are opinions that, you could say, well, it's far on this side or that side. But should that happen? Do these platforms have, in your view, a responsibility to do that? Or has that gone too far? Is it dangerous to have them doing that?
Boy, that's another tough question. Every journalist I know values free speech and what it represents in this country and how it makes us special. So, to what degree do you remove that speech? That's a tough one. To me, a better question than do we remove someone's speech is, do we have a way somehow that we can signal reliability of what they're saying to people? Is there, uh, for example, if things have been fact checked repeatedly and proved wrong, is there a way that we note that? I'm not sure there is, and that we can necessarily expect the platforms to do it. But um,
It sounds like what you're saying is, as somebody with a lot of experience in journalism, and you know a lot of journalists, is that most journalists would be hesitant to remove any source of information from one of these platforms.
I think most of the journalists I know would be incredibly hesitant to remove sources from the platform. It's a slippery slope, you know.
So let me ask you a follow up on that. Do you think that, because some do posit this, do you think government has a role in censoring certain viewpoints? Because that certainly has been in the discussion, and there have been folks that have promoted that, again, from both sides of the aisle. That has been a surprisingly bipartisan push to say, no, you shouldn't have this far left or far right, whatever. I mean, is that something that that you think has any merit at all?
Well, the tough thing there is, boy, um, that's political speech. The last thing that we, I think, need from a government is telling people you can or cannot say something. Um, yes, we can say that certain things are inappropriate, and I think we have had some famous Supreme Court cases where we've drawn the line on endangering people. You can't scream fire in a crowded theater. So there are limits on your free speech in that sense. And I think those limits that exist are probably sufficient. I mean, we managed to get through decades and decades with those limits in place. And I think it's now, because of the extreme polarization, people begin talking about putting those limits. But in reality, what I think is happening is an awful lot of people are really thinking that we should limit the other guy's ability to say things, not your own. And again, is someone who really believes in the value of free speech, I would really hesitate to ask the government to get involved in deciding what we can or cannot say.
Well, I want to make a little bit of a shift here and talk about your 35 years as a working journalist, because I know you have many, many interesting stories. And just out of curiosity, Professor, what is one of the more interesting stories you ever had to report in those years of journalism? Maybe a really difficult story that you had to do, or something that teaches a lesson, something maybe from that you say in one of your classes.
Ah, well, um, that's that's a good question. And so I'm kind of thinking in terms of uh, things that I covered. Uh, you know, there are, and I think this is an example of there are opportunities for a journalist to make a difference. And so I was covering the State Board of Education and there was a textbook adoption debate. And in those days, uh, the board dealt with a preliminary vote on a Friday and then came back on Saturday for the official meeting. At the Friday session, a number of people were upset with the history textbooks and said, we need to put a political label on every major figure. we need to say that this one was a communist, this one was a socialist, this one, whatever. And it was like, oh my word. Uh, do we want to be in the business of trying to label every major American figure in history? But um, the board listened to the opinion of a lot of speakers that day and uh, voted that they were going to amend the textbook adoption to require that. So I went back to my office and thought, I wonder what some of the best historians in the country think about this. And so I called the leading Texas historian at the time, as well as 3 or 4 of the leading historians in the country. And I posed that question on a Friday night after tracking them down. So, what do you think of this idea? And they all said, oh, this is awful. How do you pick the label? Because many of these Americans actually changed over time, and they might have been, had one political label in their 30s, a different one in their 40s, and yet a different one in their 50s. Which label are you going to, if you have to pick a single label, put on them? So I wrote the story, and the next day, the then president of the Board of Education or chair of the board came up to me and said, well, oh, and I should mention that my newspaper, the Dallas Times Herald, stripped the story 6 columns across the top of page 1. So they found it to be a really important story and gave it major play. And the next day, the chair says, all we talked about at breakfast was your story. I think you'll be interested to see the outcome. And then they voted almost unanimously to reverse themselves. And so, to me, why I think that was the reason I think that was an important story of mine is it did 2 things. One, it showed the power that an individual journalist can have. And secondly, it was also the power of seeking out authoritative voices, so that it's not because I knew anything about it, it's because I sought people who I thought would have a major voice on the topic, and they did, and it was persuasive.
So you, that is a very interesting story. And I know that similar things probably happened throughout your career in ways big and small, where just bringing out, different aspects of a story had some kind of an impact. One of the things that you did for a number of years is that you were the food critic or the restaurant critic for the Austin American-Statesman. And I think that was the last, correct me if I'm wrong, the last journalism position you held before you came to Texas A&M. Talk a little bit about how you actually did restaurant reviews, because as I recall, you couldn't just walk in and announce, hey, I'm here to review the restaurant, could you?
No. In fact, a lot of people have asked me the question over time, did you tell them that you were coming? And it's like, no, no way. And I think it's also very important to say right up front that good publications paid themselves. They never accepted a free meal from anybody over the course of that time. And so I tried to review restaurants as anonymously as possible. And I probably got away with that, I don't know, 97, 98% of the time. Occasionally, somebody spotted me, figured out I was in the dining room, but most of the time, They had no idea until I called after the fact to ask them if I could have a reporter or a photographer come and shoot photos of their food to go with the review. And so I was really um, working hard to be as invisible a patron of the restaurant that as I could possibly be when I was doing a review. And
They never printed a picture of your face while you
no,
were the food critic.
no, they never did. In fact, I was probably the only one who, in all of those years, never had a photo in the paper. And it's actually kind of an amusing story because Texas Highways magazine at one point in time got 3 restaurant critics to talk about the favorite restaurants in their towns. And it was we each had to talk about why they were personal favorites, not was this the best restaurant in town, because in all the cases they weren't like the most expensive or the #1 restaurant or stuff, but just personal favorites of ours. And so they wanted a photo, and I got so I agreed that we could do a photo as long as it didn't show my face. And so we had ended up a photo running in the magazine of me in a Panama hat. And so I have the hat on, but my head tipped way down. So it was impossible to tell anything about any feature of mine. And as you can see, my features might be easily discernible. And so if you said big guy with a beard and stuff, they might begin to look at a bunch of people and narrow it down pretty quickly.
Oh my goodness. So I guess there are probably still some people doing this kind of food journalism, although in coronavirus America, I don't know how much of it there is going on. Is there any notable food journalist whose work you really like that would be interesting for folks to take a look at?
Oh, gosh, I read the food critics in the New York Times, the Washington Post, um, the LA Times, although the longtime food critic there, who was one of the real forces in American food writing, died a few months ago. So um, that was sadly a good voice that was silenced. Um, and, you know, and non-critics. So, for example, Sam Sifton, he's in essence the food editor of the New York Times, overseeing their food sections and the app that they have. He is a very clever writer whose work I read probably 2 or 3 times a week, because he sends out some short things. There are people like David Leibowitz, who lives in Paris, who is an American expat, who has just wonderful material and a monthly newsletter. Uh, Allison Roman is a chef and food writer whose work appears in the New York Times and elsewhere, and her writing is delightful. before Thanksgiving, she did a piece on cooking a major Thanksgiving dinner in a New York apartment where it had one of those tiny stoves and a refrigerator that's more like the size of a dorm refrigerator. And so it was just a wonderful story about pulling off a big, complicated meal for a whole group of people when you're handicapped substantially by the kitchen where you live. Um, so anyway, those are a few examples of people whose writing I like, and probably right now reading the work of food writers is a great way to escape some of the depressing news that we find all around ourselves day in and day out right now.
Well, my depressing news, Professor, is that I've never eaten so much rice and pasta in my life. And so I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask, what is Dale Rice eating? What are you preparing? Because it seems like you have a constant stream of photos of delicious food that you post to Facebook. So what are you baking these days that you really like?
Well, actually, it's funny that you mentioned pasta because I cook a fair amount of pasta. Partly because in general, a lot of pasta dishes are fairly easy dishes to do. The other advantage of pasta is there is such a wide variety of ingredients that you can put with them that you can still have pasta 2 or 3 times a week and have it seem not at all repetitive, like that you uh, are not having dishes that are similar. But I think right now we're all facing the challenges of how do we work through the virus with our limitations on shopping. And I'll give you an example. I had a chicken as part of my grocery delivery. So I did a roasted chicken, and it's my favorite recipe out of a cookbook called Bouvette, in which partly it's the ease, partly it's the flavor. Um, you basically grind together fennel seeds, herbs de Provence, and some salt and smear it all over the chicken. Plop it in a cast iron skillet, stick it in a 425-degree oven for an hour and 15 minutes, and you are done. Out comes this chicken that the skin is all crisp, it's beautifully brown, perfectly tender, and you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to truss it. You didn't have to, no basting, no anything. It just went in, came out an hour and 15 minutes later. And then what happened to that chicken? Well, the leftover meat came off the bones the other day for lunch. I made a salad with chicken, green apples, and celery with tarragon and mayonnaise in it. And so chicken salad for lunch. And then I took the carcass and I made broth and used the broth because I boiled the carcass with some vegetables, strained it, had this beautiful broth, and it became a wonderful chicken and noodle and vegetable soup. So I think the thing that the current circumstances have made me do is say, how can I be a really efficient person when it comes to the food that I'm cooking and eating, so that there's a real minimum of waste, but a real bounty of flavor in the process.
Oh my goodness. I feel extraordinarily inadequate compared to that. And as I make my very simple meals out of the pantry, but I have been, as you say here too, not going really to the store, right? So you kind of eat what you've got. And then after all of this is over, which restaurant or restaurants are you going to go to? I'm sure that's probably the number one question you get in general. Just people on the street that know anything about you, they probably ask you, "Where are you eating? What's your favorite restaurant?"
Um, I will. Uh, I'll skip names. How is that? And go
Oh,
with,
you can't skip names. Come on now. You got to
okay.
name at least one or two.
All right.
Doesn't
Uh,
have to be in College Station. It can be anywhere in the state of Texas if you want to.
all right. Then I'll name a couple. So uh, one of the places that I will be going when this is over is in Houston, to Sorrento. It is a restaurant that I absolutely love because of its old style Italian offerings that begin with that bread basket that they bring out with like 7 kinds of homemade bread on it. Just a marvelous restaurant. I have had so many things off of that menu and not had a single thing that I wouldn't order a second time or a third time
Wow.
or so um, that is that's a favorite place of mine. Um, Here in College Station, uh, you know, one of the things that I have absolutely grown to love uh, and I'm really missing it now is uh, good Tex-Mex food.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
I don't make that at home. I don't have the ingredients on hand, uh, and if you're going to, you know, you stop and think about what is. We think about it being a simple meal, but think about the preparation that went into the rice. Think about the preparation that went into the refried beans
Oh
that
my
are
goodness.
on that.
I bought a bag of pinto beans, and to show you how ignorant I am about cooking, I didn't realize you had to soak beans for a long period of time before you can cook them. You can't just cook beans. You have to
Yeah.
soak the beans. Uh,
Well, and you think about these things, and like, I love a good chili relleno that is topped with a wonderful ranchero sauce, and there are some really good places, but when this is all over, probably the first place that I'll go for that chili relleno is Casa Rodriguez in Bryan.
yeah, Casa Rod is great, and yeah, there's a little taco shack just north of downtown Bryan. I don't know if it's still there. Probably it is. El Tio Taqueria. You ever go over to that
Yeah.
that place? Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, Mexican food is something that I almost wish you hadn't mentioned because I miss it so much, and I think anybody that watches this by now, they're very hungry. Um, but well, I guess the final question I would have for you, thank you for your time, is as far as where everything is going in the media. I mean, if I had to give you a crystal ball and say, okay, predict 10 years from now, where the media is going to be, because certainly, I had your classes over 10 years ago, and I think that the media has changed substantially during that time? And let's go 10 years down the road or even 20. And where do you see things going in the future with all of this, with online media, newspapers, broadcast, anything?
Well, uh, I would say a couple of things. One, that I think that this current economic crisis that is accompanying our uh, health crisis is going to push uh, more and more media outlets online in a bigger way. I expect that we're going to speed up the reduction of print media, and that's print in terms of the daily or weekly uh, news media. I think that magazines are a different ball game, and I think that they are probably going to retain a great deal of strength. We've seen niche magazines actually in a number of areas have increased significantly in numbers and readership in recent years. So I expect to see that at least stable. I expect to see news media pushed more and more online. And I think the biggest uncertainty for me that I can't predict is where are we going to go with a financial model that is sustainable. I think we have some great experiments like the Texas Tribune as a nonprofit and doing really significant work. And maybe we're going to end up having a few of those that are doing well. But my concern ultimately is in a lot of the small communities where those newspapers have been their only source of local information. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see a number of those disappear, some of them as the result of just the coronavirus situation right now, and then some of them because they managed to get through it, but they couldn't survive long term.
Well, I will, in 10 years, I'm going to have you back on when I have millions of subscribers. I will see. We'll check your prediction. Dale Rice, professor at Texas A&M, Director of Journalism Studies. Thank you so much for this conversation, very edifying and interesting. And belated sorry for all the ruckus I raised as a student in several of your journalism classes years ago.
No problem. Thank you for the conversation and inviting me on. I very much enjoyed it.
Dale Rice, professor at Texas A&M, thank you so much. And that was Dale Rice, professor and director of journalism studies at Texas A&M University in College Station. Thank you for listening today, and if you enjoy this show, please like and comment on our pages on social media and subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. Right now, we're available on Spotify and Stitcher and Deezer and a few others, and soon coming to Apple Podcasts. If you have a guest suggestion for us, or maybe you'd like to be a guest, email me at jessfieldsshow@gmail.com. Thanks and have a great day.